Well, this might seem a bit weird. If you're watching these in order, my backdrop suddenly changed and it's gonna go back to how it was after this video. But it's just taken me a while to get to this. Sorry. So instead of getting the next volume out, it's time to talk about the Fabled Short Stories collection. You might be thinking this is akin to the Royal Academy's side book, but not quite. There's not an overarching theme, but these are cut side stories for various reasons. That means the canonicity of these is kind of hard to place, but a good approach is that the events in these did happen, just a little pick and choose on how. But before we go ahead and get into this, why not hit the subscribe button and stay up to date on Bookworm content from me? And not just that, but I've got merch for sale as well, designs from this amazing series to show just how much you love it. You can also use the promo code TRASHXmas at checkout for 10% off this holiday season. And with that, let's go ahead and get into the first short stories collection. And if this video does well enough, who knows? Maybe I'll even cover the ones in the fan books too. Well, the ones that aren't covered in the short stories collection at least. But one more thing to note, the first collection covers until about part 4, volume 4, so I'm going to be avoiding spoilers after that point, so let's keep the comments clean, alright? First, we have My Little Sister's Gotten Weird from Thule's perspective. This would have taken place in volume 1 of the series, and was a previously unpublished chapter in the web novel. We get a perspective on Mine from Thule and how the sudden change Urano's memories brought about affected their daily life and interactions. Mine always being sick has pretty much sucked, since she usually whined about not getting to go do things. But now Thule's seeing her sister really determined to get up and get moving, to the point that she's not really listening anymore to her or her parents. Crazy. Also, she's obsessed with bathing and tried to break Thule's doll for a hair stick. Yeah, something's weird, but that's about all Thule notices. Later, when Mine smashes the Meryl for oil, we get Thule and Effa's reaction. Where yeah, they're mad, but also the all-in-one shampoo seems like a massive waste of ingredients. As we already know at this point, commoners really struggle as it is, so this is absolutely insane in hindsight that they're letting her get away with it. But after they see that Mine's hair is all shiny and smooth, they both give it a shot, and suddenly, Thule goes from thinking her sister went crazy from a fever to realizing she knows a lot of random stuff. Why does she know that? Who knows? But Thule's just doubling down on her weirdness now. However, her next weird thing might be pretty neat too, so now she's looking forward to it. Yeah, I'm recording this video towards the end of part 5, so this felt like a return to simpler times. And the value in this story isn't so much the new information, which is why it was cut. There's really nothing new conveyed in this story besides reaffirming Mine's weirdness, something we and her family already knew. We already saw that Thule thinks that in her side story and Effa's later on in part 1. But the difference in perspectives on specific instances gives us a better picture of why Thule tolerates Mine's odd behavior early on in the story. It goes from she's being a brat to, wait, does she just not know any better, to, actually, this strange behavior has some benefit, so maybe I'll humor her from time to time. That pretty much explains why Thule is so cooperative throughout part 1, which is sort of lost in the mainline books. So it's nice seeing that explored here. Next up is My Savior from Lutz's perspective, still taking place in the first volume of the series. He's woken up by his brothers during a sunny winter morning, which means it's time to go get some perus. They all bail out to the forest and take shifts gathering them. Sasha takes point as the oldest brother, having Sieg race up to go thaw a branch and get one loose while the rest set a fire up. The importance of that is simple. They need to warm their hands. If this had been in the story proper, this would have been our introduction to the magical nature of Bookworm. We hear knives can't cut the peru trees since they're fey plants, and the mana in the tree actually puts out fire, really solidifying a lot of ideas later on in the story that we didn't really learn until parts 2 and 3. So Lutz and his brother tag team branches, thawing them out with their hands, which makes them damn near get frostbite, where they race back down to go warm them up by the fire. As they collect their haul, noon approaches, and we see what was only described to Mine over the course of this series. Lutz bails as the tree comes to life and stretches up towards the sun as soon as noon hits. He falls and tries to catch himself, with his brothers telling him not to because that could lead to him getting carried away by the tree, but the branch is flimsy and he falls anyway. But as the light of the noon sun hits the remaining fruits, they explode, shooting their seeds off, and then the tree melts away. Crazy. Anyway, Lutz is fine, and he and his brothers make off with their haul to go process, much like we saw Mine's family do by extracting the juice and oil. The issue is Lutz's family is drowning in chicken feed made from perus because, well, they have chickens, and everyone trades them feed for eggs. And with his brothers taking his food, Lutz is always starving. That's when Mine swings by and enlightens them about the beauty of peru cakes. This time we get Lutz's perspective on it, and he's happy to see Mine make his brothers contribute for once. So it's not just his crap that's getting taken. Thus Mine becomes his savior, by giving him a source of food throughout winter. That's when he vows to himself to do whatever she needs, and be her arms and legs. It's honestly a shame that this was cut from the mainline books, because it accomplishes so much in such a short span. It not only introduces the magical elements of the story in a much more effective way than the shoemill hunting in Volume 1, but fleshes out Lutz's brothers, while also going to great lengths to establish what drives the boy in Part 1 and 2. The fact that he's so readily devoted to Mine does come off as weird in hindsight, but this side story gets you into his mindset so much more than the main books, that I buy that he's willing to do whatever she says. Next is My Daughter's About to Be a Criminal from Gunther's perspective, taking place around Mine's first harrowing trip to the forest. Gunther is stressed out at the gate because Thule promised to watch Mine and come back early, but as the day went on, she didn't come back. In fact, Thule only arrived with the rest of the kids when most people come back at the end of the day. But still no Mine. Gunther questions her, but asks to wait until they get home because it's a long story. Yeah, clearly these kids are hiding something. Otto says it must not have been that serious or else they would have asked for help, which is when Lutz brings Mine back. She apologizes and Gunther demands to know what happened, but Lutz says to direct all blame at Mine. She broke her promise and forced everyone to work for her, and they couldn't force her to stop because she got mad after Lutz's brothers destroyed the tablet she was making, and Mine gets pretty damn scary when she's mad. Back at home finally, Gunther puts his foot down while Mine is passed out. She's forbidden from going to the forest anytime soon, but Thule pleads with him and says that that would be a bad idea. In fact, Mine might just straight up kill Faye as a result. Oh no, that would make her a criminal. Yeah, this isn't a cute display, like Thule is actually terrified here, and Gunther goes to say something to her while she's in bed. But when he tells her she can't go to the forest anymore, she just tells Thule to bring the clay tablets back so she can make them here instead. Thule agrees quickly because she's treating this as a threat, but Gunther again tells her no. Mine busts out some horror cliches, and gets creepy enough that Gunther and Thule are seriously freaked, all while muttering some pop culture references in Japanese. But while Gunther tries to talk her down, Thule gets him out of the room and explains that this is what happened in the forest. Not only was she creepy, but her eyes were glowing rainbow colored, and there was this yellow mist seeping off of her. The reason they were late is because everyone was far too scared of Mine to stop working, but Lutz eventually managed to rein her in. Okay, so how can they stop Mine from getting like this? Ask Lutz. So Gunther does the next day, and Lutz is more impressed how smart Mine is than anything. He also has zero sympathy for his brothers in this situation. They brought it about on themselves. Yeah, Mine's gonna end up being a criminal at this rate, but Lutz tells Gunther that wouldn't be the case if he just lets her go back to the forest to finish her tablets. Okay, so to avoid that, Gunther relents and allows her to go back, despite Mine having already been plotting her revenge. Alright, he couldn't really punish her for the whole breaking her promise in the first place. That sucks. This was supposed to be our initial introduction to Mine's crushing abilities told from another character's perspective. And while this is a very charming side story, there's not really much new information actually added. The most we get is how other people view Mine's freakouts, which we see is just something they don't really bring up in the mainline books very often because, well, it freaks them out. Here we see that firsthand, as well as Lutz's devotion to Mine in full force, making him seem more like a certain arch scholar later on in this story than the Lutz we're used to. Next we have Servants of Sister Christine from Wilma's perspective. This showcases her daily life in the orphanage as she teaches the kids about proper manners, while also remarking on how much Mine has changed the temple from the Grey Robe's perspective. In fact, Wilma was already instilling the virtue of being grateful to Mine even this far back in the story, but as she listens to the kids talk about the workshop, Wilma's impression is that it blends Mine's understanding of the temple and merchant cultures, and that influence is seeping into the orphanage itself, by teaching them to cook and earn their own money, and Mine is humble about this all too, making Wilma admire her even more. After that, she's in her room making Karud while waiting for Rozemyne to come visit, because she's aware Mine was going to talk to her about her behavior after becoming her attendant. So when she finally does enter, Wilma explains that Rozemyne is mistaken about Mine being just like Christine, and she has her own expectations. Also, you know, Mine is compromising by giving her just paperwork instead of physical work, so after basically telling Rozemyne to rethink her expectations, Wilma sends her off. Mine visits to talk to Wilma about how Rozemyne changed and thanks her for speaking to her, but Wilma takes this time to turn it into a lesson for Mine too. Rozemyne was crying as soon as she got into her room, but before that, she didn't let the slightest hint of her emotion show. Rozemyne would make a good role model for mine, basically, so she should work hard to learn as well. After all, there aren't any blue shrine maidens for her to learn from in the temple, but Rozemyne was closer to Christine's best friend than a servant, so she'll make for the next best thing as she was educated alongside her lady, and mine'll think that over. This shares a lot of crossover with the story we actually got in Part 2, Volume 2 from Rozemyne's perspective, but the focus here wasn't on Rozemyne's issues, but actually Wilma's role in the temple. This shows her thought process on how even at this early stage, her admiration for mine was bordering on mania like we see later on. But while the conversation with Rozemyne is a main element here and basically the exact same, it does show us Wilma's thought process and her views on this situation, and we find out she's much more sympathetic to mine while still caring for Rozemyne as her friend. It's why she makes such a good mediator in this series. Next is I'm Not Giving Up My Daughter from Gunther's perspective, where this was originally a short story written as an order bonus for Part 2, Volume 1. This is also our introduction to LAKEY, who was Gunther's subordinate in Part 4, Volume 4 side story with the city remodel. LAKEY asks about mine, and Gunther's annoyed that she's not visiting as often. And he's not alone. While Gunther assumes that LAKEY is being a creep, he's actually just missing her handling the written work, because without her, Oto's thrusting it all on him, and he's getting compared to mine every time, which is pretty damn annoying, since he's not a prodigy like her. So maybe they could train some more kids to do paperwork. Mine did get Lutz to learn math over winter, so perhaps she might know some tricks. At their house, he asks her, and she briefly suggests hiring Great Priest for the job, but that also won't work. They lack the experience dealing with commoners in the first place. As mine mentions wanting orphans to leave the temple and go work in the lower city in 10 to 20 years time, Gunther is made aware of the gap forming between him and his daughter. She's slowly getting sucked into the world of the nobles, and he instinctively grabs her in response. He won't let the gods or temple take his daughter away. Now, this story doesn't really add a ton to the overall narrative of Bookworm, but it works as a pre-order bonus for a volume by just giving us some more character interactions. It does introduce LAKEY a lot earlier than his original debut, which gives him somewhat of an arc, while also foreshadowing Gunther's very real concerns about the temple taking mine for the nobility. And it does all this in a silly few pages about a doting father. That's some of the charm this franchise has that most others can't quite nail. Next is studying literature and picture books from Thule's perspective. This was another original piece written for TO Books crossover in 2016, and takes place when Thule wanted to learn to read and write in Part 2, Volume 2. She asks Mine for a book to practice with, and Mine obliges, and gives her a slate pen and board to write on too. Mine teaches her to draw straight lines as practice before moving on to actual letters, and in order to get her used to this process, she also reads the picture Bible to Thule. But before long, Mine has to bail with Lutz to go to the temple for her apprentice work, while Thule keeps on practicing that day. Effa chats with her about how nostalgic this whole process is, as her father was a gate commander, but Effa's parents are dead at this point, so Thule doesn't really know much about him. Thule has a great idea though. They can learn their letters together. Too bad Effa's busy making baby clothes for Camille, since he's a few months out from being born. So she makes a deal with Thule to teach her over winter. I mean, they're both going to be holed up anyway from the snow, which motivates Thule to get good enough to actually teach Effa. And with that, Thule's thoughts wander as she keeps practicing to just how much books cost. The hairpin she made was pretty damn expensive, but how much is this thing here? And when she asks Mine after she gets back, she about has a damn near meltdown because she's gotten it dirty and such. Yeah, the hairpins they make sell for a few small silver, but this book here is worth over a small gold coin. Yikes. At that price, Thule's too scared to even touch it anymore. This is another interesting side story as it foreshadows or perhaps backfills some minor details we already saw in the story. Thule does teach Effa enough to read and write to sign hers and Camille's name in Part 2, Volume 4, and there's a certain charm in teaching Thule the value of the items they're creating. Her reference point is the hairpins because the amount of money Mine is talking about here is insanely large. So that book is worth literally dozens of hairpins to Thule, or in other words, probably an entire season's worth of work for their house. What I like about stories like this is how they integrate smaller details into the main series, and show the background of a lot of little details like this, which is great for extra bonus content. Next we have My New Lady from Riarda's perspective, taking place between Part 2 and Part 3. And what Riarda is staring down is a summons from Sylvester after he did the unthinkable and locked up his mother out of nowhere, all without laying the proper groundwork to do so. Sylvester's other retainers are completely in the dark and hoping Riarda can learn as much as possible to make their jobs easier moving forward. And she's actually on top of that, planning on giving Sylvester and Karstedt a stern talking to since they clearly had this plot in motion for a while without consulting anyone. And for changes this big, they definitely needed to. So she heads off to his office and finds Elvira, Karstedt, and Sylvester are the only ones inside, and they hand her a sound blocker right away. That's when they drop the news that he's adopting Karstedt's secret daughter who was raised in the temple, and Sylvester wants to make Riarda her head attendant. Wait, what? No. Riarda calls him a fool for doing this amidst the already unprecedented chaos in the castle. Adopting a Lies Gang thoroughbred like Karstedt's daughter right now will only embolden her family. And what about his own recently baptized son who was raised by Veronica herself? He's gonna be struggling the most out of everyone here. But Sylvester tells her this adoption can't be undone. He's already heard about how bad of an idea this is from Florencia, but he can't go back. It's worth noting Riarda does actually suss out that Rozemyne isn't Elvira's biological daughter, but Elvira silences that concern by saying that once she's baptized, she will be her daughter legally. Okay then, so what manner of girl is this? They explain her saint legend and Riarda is already skeptical, but they're all serious. She was raised in the temple too, so they're really gonna put this girl through all this torment? And yeah, because there's things Rozemyne can only protect through this adoption. Alright, so Riarda pieces together that this is important and accepts the job. Later, Riarda speaks to Elvira and figures out what type of person Rozemyne is, that she's smart but strange. Yeah, Sylvester's phrasing wasn't deceptive, that's just the type of person Rozemyne is. But more impressive is how involved Ferdinand is and the fact that he's taking care of a little girl. Who would have thought that he could manage something like that, huh? And it's also having a positive impact on him too. After the incident at the baptism showcased her poor health and killed their chance to meet, we move right along to the castle where Riarda gives Rozemyne passing marks on her introduction. Ferdinand and Karstedt seem to have taught her well. I think what makes this side story stand out isn't so much the information physically contained within it, but really shows how oblivious Rozemyne was after her adoption to the politics surrounding her situation. Part 3 really doesn't address these topics because Rozemyne is so sheltered from them, she never really has to deal with them. Besides, she's too busy being traumatized and fetching ingredients to even notice. But it's nice to see the perspective of someone who's in the thick of it, recognizing a lot of the issues that would seem obvious to readers come Part 4, with so much political fallout that felt absent in Part 3, at least from Rozemyne's perspective. Next is that fateful ceremony from Hartmut's perspective, taking place near the start of Part 3. This was written for the series illustrator's birthday, and a heavily requested side story about Hartmut's one-sided first meeting with Rozemyne, essentially detailing the drastic shift in his character that many have described in the mainline books. So right after Ottilie returns from a tea party with Elvira, she gives Hartmut a sound blocker and informs him, like he should already know, that Elvira's daughter is due to be baptized, and he's immediately skeptical. Also, he's not informed, because he's known Cornelius since before his baptism, and he never mentioned having a sister before. Thus, Hartmut concludes that this isn't Elvira's biological daughter, meaning born of a Veronica faction med noble, and Ottilie is gonna serve her after she's being adopted by the archducal family. Yeah, he's opposed to her serving someone of such low status. Ottilie picks up on this and explains the situation, that she'll become the hope of the Lies Gangs if adopted. But Hartmut, even as a second year in the academy, can deduce that there's a plot in play, and the fact that his mother is just going along with it doesn't sit right with him. Like, did she talk to his father about this? And yeah, she did. In fact, with all the changes in the castle, this will afford them a chance to see behind the curtain, and this was also Lieberecht's request in the first place, while allowing the Lies Gangs to regain some of their lost influence. Yeah, as soon as factions were brought up, Hartmut stopped caring at all. The internal struggles of Ehrenfest don't really interest him, because he quickly realized that their place in the pecking order as a middle duchy without any of the influence that would normally carry is due to the fact that they only attained their status by other duchies falling. The winners of the Civil War don't view their neutrality favorably, so thus Ehrenfest is scorned from both sides. While their duchy is meaningless in the grand scheme of things, Hartmut finds it pathetic that his mother is serving a girl born of a med noble for his father in faction. But when the baptism comes around, a few things do stand out. It's being held late in the season for one, between the start and starbind ceremonies, but Sylvester's retainers, being mostly from the former Veronica faction, are causing tensions to be high, especially with all the big Lies Gang players there too. But amongst this, Hartmut hears his mother talking to Riarda about serving Rozemyne as well. Now that does pique his interest, with Rozemyne being held up as someone of great importance. So yeah, now he's wondering what Sylvester is up to, and after hearing how much Ferdinand is expecting of her, he's now a little worried for this girl. Though based on the stories, Hartmut is aware just how skilled Ferdinand is from his older brother, and suspects that he might be behind this whole situation. But come the ceremony, Rozemyne gets passing marks as an archnoble from Hartmut, surprising him somewhat, but not enough to justify all this hype. That is until she breaks from the usual baptism script and fires off a massive blessing to everyone in the hall. Okay, that actually catches everyone's attention. Just how much mana does that little body of hers have? Okay, the mana here is impressive, but what Hartmut's moved by is the sheer beauty of her praying. Like it came from the gods themselves. No longer was he emotionless, he actually is getting worked up for the first time in his life. And after hearing Sylvester talk about her accomplishments in the temple, suddenly Hartmut's adjusting his appraisal of Sylvester somewhat. Okay, for introductions, he's just hoping his mother and father's status will make him stand out somewhat. That way he might be able to work for her in the future. But while he's looking forward to that, Wilfried strikes and drags Rozemyne off, causing her to pass out. Yeah, that's the moment that Hartmut started to view Wilfried as an enemy, and plots to drag him down, while propping Rozemyne up to be the next Daub. This is the side story I reference a lot when talking about Hartmut's massive shift in character others talk about in the story, and even through his mania, this informs a lot about how he views his own duchy and its nobles. He never really cared about Ehrenfest, and that baptism ceremony left a profound impact on him as a person, getting him interested in the gods to the point that he actively seeks Rozemyne's service and is willing to visit the temple. That religious experience and stories of her sainthood actually give him something to be passionate about for the first time in his life, because as we saw, he's been an uninterested genius trapped in the mediocrity that is his home duchy, which would have likely led to him moving to the sovereignty after graduation had Rozemyne not come along. So while this isn't fundamental to understanding Hartmut's character in the story, it makes a lot of his little comments about Ehrenfest's internals and nobles from his own faction make more sense. It's also just nice to see Rozemyne's baptism from another perspective among the crowd. Next is a tea party with my older sister from Christelle's perspective. Wait, who the hell is Christelle? Literally no one of import. That's kind of the point. She's a med noble from a neutral family, and is only a vehicle to explore the events of Part 3 Volume 1's concert from the viewpoint of a regular noble in attendance. Her sister married into a Veronica faction family due to the apparent dominance of Veronica herself. Especially after Wilfried's baptism, they all assumed that she would be in power for the foreseeable future, so their family is trying to realign itself after the recent political shakeup, back to being more neutral, with Christelle allowed to socialize with her Lies Gang friend once more. She attended the Harspiel concert, but her older sister couldn't because her husband forbid her from going. And tea parties have been a massive drag for those who couldn't go because they feel left out. Thus she comes to her sister for some more insight, hoping to understand what she missed out on. So after the pleasantries, they launch into a discussion where we find out that Christelle is annoyed at Sylvester, and their family doesn't really have a high opinion of him anyway. His actions have caused their family a lot of stress. Due to his refusal to take a second wife and letting his mother run rampant over the duchy, Christelle's sister married into the Veronica faction after word of Wilfried's baptism came down, with the assumption that her grip on power would remain strong for the foreseeable future. But then out of the blue, the Ob acted, imprisoning her, and still won't take a second wife to stabilize the duchy. Thus the neutral nobles are all clinging to archnoble houses for protection. But with the recent adoption, they expect the Lies Gangs to receive more favor from now on. And thus the neutral nobles are now cozying on up to them too. Her sister's husband isn't bending a knee to the new political direction of the duchy either, so that's annoying. How's Christelle gonna fare now that she's about to graduate? Well, she's been told to find a Lies Gang husband, and she wants to find someone who could boost her image. So she's asked her friend from the Lies Gang faction to help. Funny enough, she was forbidden from speaking to her until recently, but she continued to be friends with her in secret only at the academy. And hey, that actually paid off. In fact, after sharing her treasures from the Harspiel concert with her sister, cookies and the printed posters, making her sister's jaw drop at the amount of money they spent, we find out that her mother only calmed her father by saying this money was to build connections to the Lies Gang and Florencia factions. After gossiping for a bit about the concert, an ordinance arrives from Christelle's friend extending an invitation to Elvira's place for a tea party follow-up. And when news comes down that Sylvester leaked the picture of Ferdinand, and they won't be able to do another concert because of that, she's not seeing herself warming up to Baronfest anytime soon. So, this was a very different sort of side story, and epitomizes what I talked about with Riarda's a few back. This is about a character we don't know in the slightest, and yet it fits seamlessly into the world, telling us a ton about the backdrop of politics we didn't really see much in part 3. Now, it's not really a ton new from what we already know after reading Riarda and Hartmut's side stories, but it's interesting seeing the perspective of someone who's a med noble being thrown around by the constant changes Sylvester and Rozemyne are introducing on a seeming whim. The resentment that creates because of something like overthrowing a tyrant greatly inconveniences those in the system said tyrant built, which is a rarely seen side of the story, and why this one stood out to me. Next is where my path leads from Lamprecht's perspective. This takes place in Part 3, Volume 3, when Wilfried is on the cusp of being disowned, and Lamprecht has the chance to stop serving him. He races home to speak with Elvira, who wants to hear Lamprecht's unfiltered report, instead of the second-hand one through Karstedt. This is a good chance for her to give her son some real advice too. Lamprecht lays out the situation, that after Wilfried spent the day in Rozemyne's shoes, he's really thrown himself into his work, which is admirable, but he's racing to catch up to the bare minimum that's expected for his position. Lamprecht doesn't sugarcoat it either. He knows that Veronica probably allowed him to get this bad because she desired a puppet Archduke. He was even ordered never to defy his lord under any circumstances, which is where we learn some interesting information that Oswald of all people is working the hardest, and refusing to take on new retainers because they could be dismissed at a moment's notice. Actually good damage control for once. Elvira asks what Wilfried's retainers think of Rozemyne since they're all from the former Veronica faction, and Lamprecht admits that she's getting the brunt of their ire. While Wilfried's poor education is the root cause here, it only came to light because of her and Ferdinand, so they're pissed off. But Oswald's actually aware of how bad this is, and even gave Lamprecht the choice to resign before he gets removed. So Lamprecht wants to know what he should do since this impacts their house. And Elvira says she doesn't need him to protect her anymore since Veronica's influence is fading. Nice setup for that, but Lamprecht entered Wilfried's service to protect his mother from Veronica's abuse. She suggests that if Lamprecht quits, he could join Rozemyne's service. Now, he hadn't even considered that, but good to know. The next day, Karstedt calls him into his office because Elvira told him everything, obviously. He wants Lamprecht to be aware of what he'd be signing up for with Rozemyne. Lamprecht wouldn't mesh well with her management style, would need to visit the temple, and eat and sleep in commoner spaces during spring prayer. And that's on top of the fact that he'd be serving Ferdinand indirectly. Yikes. Karstedt won't stop him from serving her, but he says it's not a great idea. After some thought, Lamprecht actually agrees that it's not for him. However, after leaving his father's office, Eckhart calls him over for a chat too. It's a regular family reunion today, because he tells him that he's worried. And that's shocking because Eckhart and worry don't really go together. However, Eckhart doesn't actually care about his petty problems. He just wants his brother to quit being so half-assed. That sounds pretty harsh considering Lamprecht took over guarding Wilfried for his mother's sake because Eckhart refused, but Eckhart actually corrects his misunderstanding. He didn't refuse to serve Wilfried, he was prevented from doing it by their family. Eckhart would have leapt at the chance to get close enough to Veronica to kill her ass, but Karstedt stopped him and has been keeping him away from the castle ever since. But still, half-assed? Well, yeah. Because while he has the chance to quit, a true guard knight wouldn't. Not in his lord's time of need at least. Yeah, it isn't up to Oswald to decide if Lamprecht is needed still, it's Wilfried's. Okay, he's got it now. So when he heads back to see Wilfried, the kid shows him the crap that he's accomplished and he's proud. So thus, Lamprecht decides to stay without question, and even tells Oswald as much. Which puts him at ease since he was testing to see if Lamprecht was in this for the long haul. The story on the surface here seems to be about Lamprecht's struggle, but the underlying information here is about Wilfried's retainer's mindset, even this far back. This tells us that Oswald has always been dedicated to his lord, but also at one point, he was actively looking out for his best interests. Which is a far cry from his portrayal later on in this story, when he ordered Rozemyne's retainers around to support Wilfried and take credit for their actions. This shows just how paranoid he and the rest of Wilfried's staff are about Rozemyne. Her skills have been shoved in their face, and now they're worried she's gonna take Wilfried's place, treating them like they treated the Lies gangs. And this is all framed against Lamprecht's struggle, and showcasing a bit of Eckhart's personality too, and how he's completely devoted to his lord, and takes no crap from others showing half-heartedness. Next is travel tales for Justus from Eckhart's perspective. This is the scrapped epilogue from Part 3, Volume 3, and covers a lot of the main conversation there just from Justus and Eckhart's perspectives. They're meeting at Eckhart's estate to talk things over about Rozemyne's Jareve progress, and also to talk next steps. The whole goddess's bath incident is fresh in Eckhart's mind, and he has the unfortunate task of telling Justus all about it, which is going to be annoying since he missed it. But hey, they also get to gush about Ferdinand, because Eckhart witnessed a lot about his lord that he's never seen before. Like him prioritizing Rozemyne's health and eating food from her without even testing it for poison. That all floored him, and Justus is just as surprised. Originally, Eckhart only saw Rozemyne as someone whose weakness caused trouble for Ferdinand, but now he's finally starting to see her use, so he's much more lenient with her. It's also brought up that Eckhart is gathering his old Ditter and Night Course documents for Daniel to help Cornelius and Angelica study. Seems silly, but Eckhart is warming up to them both, while also using this opportunity to teach them about his Lord and Savior Ferdinand, so Justus teases him here. As for the goddess's bath, Justus wonders if cross-dressing would get him in to gather by tricking the gods, but Eckhart just brushes his antics off, as long as he doesn't get him or Ferdinand involved. Speaking of, their next goal is the egg from Mount Lowenberg, and Eckhart immediately bans Justus from coming due to their last incident there. Yeah, I'm breezing past this one because there's really no new information here. This is essentially the same as what we got in the novels, just from a different character's perspective, while adding a few hints about Eckhart's thoughts on the rest of the cast, which is admittedly nice. The biggest notes are just how overtly hostile he is to most, when Rozemyne usually barely remarks on his presence. But there's also the fact that he and Justus don't actually get along very well despite their work relationship. Yeah, they butt heads in a lot of areas, and that comes through in this side story. However, at the same time, they still respect and rely on one another enough when it comes down to it, showing a pretty strong bond and complicated relationship. Next is time with my siblings from Wilfrid's perspective, taking place during the first Archduke conference after Rozemyne was adopted. This is another sales bonus from Part 3, Volume 4, this time centering around Wilfrid visiting Charlotte and Melchior prior to their baptisms in the main building. So he heads up to their chambers on the 3rd floor because his parents wanted Wilfrid to visit while they were gone, and this is all hot off the heels of Wilfrid's competence scare. So he's feeling both nervous and weirdly superior due to his educational growth in such a short span. He asks Oswald about Veronica since he assumes she's just been sick this whole time, but Oswald just dodges the question. Yeah, he knows what's up. That's when he bumps into Rozemyne and tries to invite her along for the visit as well, but Riarda refuses on her behalf, saying half-siblings wouldn't be permitted to visit in the first place. Wait, what does that mean? Well, since Rozemyne is adopted, she doesn't share a mother, and is essentially treated as Wilfrid's half-sibling from a hierarchical standpoint. Oswald explains that Wilfrid made a mistake inviting her, and to be more mindful in the future. Oh, so Veronica is his half-sibling too then, since they spent time before their baptism together, but they also don't share a mother? Yeah, as it turns out, Wilfrid's understanding of family has always been deeply flawed, so he gets into his sibling's room, and Charlotte manages a greeting while Melchior barely mumbles a few words of one because he's mostly just mimicking Charlotte. Wilfrid questions if Melchior's retainers aren't being strict enough with his education, so he should probably speak to their mother about it later. Hell, he thinks they might need to change them out before he gets disgraced like Wilfrid almost was, so thus he shows off the Karuda and teaches Charlotte to play while crushing her hard in the game itself. Melchior is watching and Wilfrid thinks he's teaching him too, but he's much too young to actually understand. Charlotte wishes that Florencia would have given her Karuda too, but Wilfrid says these are actually from Rozemyne, and he's inadvertently talking her up to his siblings, but Wilfrid is willing to take on Charlotte's challenges anytime. That confuses her, like, what the hell is he talking about challenges? And he's annoyed that they've hit a wall in communication, because she doesn't yet know about the playroom. Anyway, Melchior snatches one of the cards, and that ruins the game. So Wilfrid scolds him for not playing right. How will he ever learn if he doesn't play correctly? Charlotte has to remind him that Melchior is literally 3 years old, and crying because his brother's yelling at him. Oswald steps up to say he's holding Melchior to too high of a standard, and that makes Wilfrid question what standard he should be holding him to. I don't know, did he try asking his retainers? They explain that Melchior likes hearing stories, and would probably enjoy the book much more than the Karuda. So Wilfrid reads the book like Rozemyne did for him, and the two younger ones enjoy it quite a bit. Though Charlotte asks what type of person Rozemyne is. You know, since she's gonna be moving in with her into the northern building soon. Wilfrid describes her as harsh as hell, because that's his perspective. That's not very nice, and it does give Charlotte the wrong impression, to the point that Lamprecht actually steps up to correct it. But the damage is kinda done. Back in his room, he's told to work on praising people more to put Charlotte more at ease before winter, since she and Rozemyne are gonna be neighbors on the 3rd floor. You don't want to give her a bad impression of Rozemyne, right? This story, I feel, should have probably just been in the books. It gives us a much needed introduction to Charlotte before the volume she appears in as an actual character, besides just being mentioned and giving her night greetings at dinner. This also reveals a ton about Wilfried's mental state that I do think is pretty key to his character, mainly his completely out of whack comparison skills due to his shit upbringing by Veronica, and then he was thrown into the deep end with Rozemyne and Ferdinand. Seeing his misunderstandings about family relations and standards to hold people to are really fundamental aspects of his character arc, and ones that impact him not just into part 4, but even beyond that. So seeing all that established this early on would have been some great groundwork. I also think it's worth mentioning the minor error in the illustration here. Yeah, if you pay attention, Wilfried is wearing his Royal Academy uniform. He definitely shouldn't have that or the cape on because, you know, he's only 8 at this point, so he wouldn't be wearing all black or have a cape. Next is a miserable morning full of regret from Cornelius' perspective as some cut content during Rozemyne's coma at the end of part 3, volume 5. Following the interrogation the previous night, he's racked with guilt over failing to catch the criminal responsible for the attack on Rozemyne. Between his duty and orders, he can't really tell if he made the right decision, and now his charge's fate is up in the air. And that next morning, he's up early because he couldn't sleep. Elvira comforts him as best as she can, explaining it was Rozemyne's orders to protect Charlotte, and it's not Cornelius' fault because if anyone should feel responsible, it's Charlotte's guard knights for failing to protect their lady in the first place. Though Cornelius doesn't think that's a fair assessment, based on the layout of the confrontation, someone was bound to get kidnapped. Great. If he can think like that, he should be thinking about what comes next instead. Rozemyne is safe since Ferdinand said as much. He always gives himself an out, so if he spoke confidently, she's definitely safe. And while Elvira seems calm in this conversation, she's definitely not. Yeah, she's not looking forward to dealing with the lies gangs in the wake of this attack, as it crushed their hopes. And Cornelius is gonna have to do that in the playroom and academy too. So thus Elvira asks Cornelius to speak to Karstedt should the chance arise to gather intelligence. Yeah, there's a definite gap between adult and children nobles, as she's already trying to gather intelligence on this. I can't really say much about this one, as it's cut content for the next side story, and it doesn't really tell us a ton about anything new, which makes it some of the most boring sort of cut content to cover. It shows us Cornelius' mental struggle more than the mainline books, but we already got a pretty good picture of the state Rozemyne's guards were in from the side stories in that volume, so really it's just more of that. I guess I won't turn it down. Next is to protect my little sister, still from Cornelius' perspective. This is the uncut sales bonus from the same volume, and focuses more on Cornelius' relationships than anything else. Expect some repeated conversation beats since rewrites moved some key information around. At the castle, Damiel notices that Cornelius is tired. Bridget, Damiel, and Angelica are the ones to cheer him up in this scene, by pretty much saying the same things Elvira did. That they followed Rozemyne's orders, and they have to think how to protect her in the future. They want to attend Grausam's interrogation that day, but Riarda blocks them to focus on the playroom using Rozemyne's instructions. Okay, so they do that instead. Where Cornelius spreads word for the students to gather intelligence in the academy. Wilfried is busy sharing what he's allowed to with the other children, and that gets some of them talking where a few names stand out. Matthias, Grausam's son, mentions he wished he had been there to see the fight because he'll be a knight one day. Judith too, since she wants to protect the country gate. And they ask Lieseletta if she'll be a knight like her sister, but her house is known for attendance. And that's when Hartmut approaches and says that if Cornelius needs intel, he should have come to him in the first place, since they're friends, right? That's a stretch, considering how weird Hartmut has been lately. But when he notices Brunhilde and Leonor behind him, he pieces together that this intelligence is probably for the lies gangs. Cornelius tries to brush him off, but he invites himself to lunch with a little lie. Thus, he gets to speak to Cornelius alone for a bit. He gives him a sound blocker and lays into the poor kid about how much of a failure he is for not protecting Rozemyne. Yeah, that might have worked on Cornelius that morning, but he's over his slump by now. He rebukes Hartmut's accusations by saying Rozemyne ordered him to protect Charlotte. Wait, what? Yeah, that's news to Hartmut. But hearing that she raced to save a girl she barely knew makes no sense to a noble. Then again, maybe that's part of her temple upbringing. Hartmut starts mumbling about her education, and Cornelius is not interested in the slightest. That is until Hartmut says that as her blood brother, he seems to be lacking the mindset to get his sister the seat of Ob. Hold on now, Rozemyne doesn't want it, and she's too sickly for the job. Besides, you do know his family, right? They're not gonna toss Sylvester's kids aside for Rozemyne. She'd either be married out of the duchy or just sent back to the temple if she tried to become Archduchess. Hartmut's shocked by that, but Rozemyne doesn't see the temple in a negative light, and that makes Hartmut want to see it for himself. Too bad no nobles can get in with Ferdinand watching over it. Great. And Hartmut was gonna start serving her this winter. Can't Cornelius just start treating him like one of her retainers now? This conversation harkens back to Hartmut's mindset in a previous entry of this book, but basically he's changed his mind completely and wants to serve Rozemyne to make her ob. That's insane. Hartmut would be committing himself to Rozemyne for life, since he wouldn't be able to resign for marriage like a woman would. So, wouldn't he be better off serving Wilfried instead? No, he refuses that flat out. But what about Cornelius? Wasn't he gonna quit as soon as she was established somewhat? Yeah, but he can't back down now, so thus begins Cornelius's battle to save Rozemyne from danger of every kind. This is a much better entry as a side story, and one I would have liked to have seen in the actual book, as it conveys the same information as previously, while introducing a lot of key players next part and beyond, establishing Cornelius's main motivation going forward, while also creating a more interesting throughline than the previous cut content established. Cornelius's moping isn't the point here, it's just the initial incident that kickstarts his motivation. And that's a more mobile story arc to follow. Content like this makes me frustrated how limited the side stories are, and this was desperately needed in the mainline books. I would have loved to have had that slight connection to Rozemyne's future retainers in earlier volumes. That way it didn't seem like a ton of new names thrown at us in the first book of part 4. Her just interacting with some of them in the playroom or something would have been enough. It makes me feel like a lot more connecting threads in part 3 were just cut out in the editing phase, and that's definitely felt. Next is special accommodations from Hersher's perspective, taking place during Rozemyne's coma. This is another sales bonus for part 4 volume 1, and gives us much more insight into Hersher's history going into her proper introduction. She's brewing up a storm in the lab at the Royal Academy when she gets an ordinance from the guards asking her to open up the dorm. She's in the zone and not really in the mood to go, so she mentally just tells them they'll have to wait and ignores it. But you know, it's Hersher, so she gets another ordinance asking her to open up the dorm yet again. Don't they know she's busy? Again, doesn't answer. One final ordinance arrives from Norbert informing her that they need the dorm open now for the Archduke conference. Great, so she finally puts down her brewing and fetches the key from her hidden room. Her plan is to just unlock the door and bail, but as soon as she inserts the key, the door swings open and Norbert pops out from the other side, demanding to know why she didn't respond to their requests. She tries to brush him off, where we learn that Norbert is actually Hersher's uncle. Yeah, so he's not taking her excuses. It's about time for her to move back into the dorm like a proper supervisor, but Hersher declines. The fact Sylvester's children are going to enroll in the academy this year informs Norbert's push, but Hersher still won't budge. Not unless Sylvester himself asks her, since she's aware that Wilfried was raised by Veronica and only sees trouble coming from dealing with him so often. But this talk still isn't over. He informs Hersher that they require special accommodations for Rozemyne too. So he hands over the documents from Sylvester and her doctor to present to the professors and the royal family for approval. Rozemyne's reputation precedes her, thanks to Hartmut, but Hersher's more surprised that Veronica allowed this adoption in the first place, and actually assumes this is Sylvester's newest sacrifice to stay Archduke. Yeah, she doesn't have a high opinion of her home duchy, not after how she and Ferdinand had been treated, so she returns to her lab and decides to read through the documents so she can present her case, the details of which make her head spin. It implies that Sylvester is actually acting like an archduke for once, but damn if their duchy isn't in a state if their nobles are attacking the archducal family. But her assumption still doesn't paint Sylvester in the best light, realizing Rozemyne was injured protecting Charlotte. The paperwork from her doctor is immediately recognizable as Ferdinand's, so I guess his position must have improved somewhat since his days in the temple, if he's able to work in the castle again. Though it's a little disappointing he didn't at least slip Hersher a letter letting her know how he's doing. When it's time to bring the case before the professors, they are a bit skeptical, but once the excuses line up, it all makes sense. Her Jareve lasting so long was assumed to be because Eckhart gave her his, but since he was married, it did complicate issues. Then they gave her Karstedts in a rush, and that caused a rejection. So basically it's a miracle things are even progressing at this point. They assume Rozemyne's probably just gonna die, but in case she doesn't, they approve the special circumstances. And with that, Hersher delivers the approval to Norbert so Sylvester can secure the kings. It's not until autumn that she hears anything else when Ferdinand sends her another letter. this time with a lot more details that floor Hersher. But basically, Ferdinand is asking Hersher to look after Rozemyne, and she'll likely enjoy her company due to her unique thought process. And after reading that, she's now very interested in meeting the disciple of her disciple. Much like my thoughts on the previous side story, I enjoyed this one as an introduction to Hersher while actually telling us a lot more about her relationships with her home. That really informs her decisions and actions much better than we got in the mainline books. At least until like midway through part 4, but how much she dislikes Sylvester, her assumptions about Veronica because she doesn't maintain contact, and even how she's related to Norbert makes Hersher a more interesting character than just the quirky mad scientist type we got. However, I just really wish this had been a side story in part 4 volume 1. The whole sales bonus aspect sucks for those who live outside Japan, because we're not getting them until they're included in an anthology collection like this. I do also want to note, if you look at Ehrenfest's map, there's a province that has a similar name to Hersher, but we find out here she's not actually from that province. Next is She Who Saved My Heart from Roderick's perspective, taking place while Rozemyne returned to Ehrenfest for the dedication ritual. This introduces a lot of the former Veronica faction students before they became more relevant to the story, and showcases how poorly Roderick is treated, and that informs his desire to join Rozemyne's service. After the former Veronica faction kids questioned why they can't socialize with Arnsbach anymore, where Roderick is shoved to the forefront as a sacrifice, they get the Archducal family's perspective, and thus hold a meeting to plan their next moves. Matthias praises Roderick for asking in the first place, but he's still not getting off that easy, as those in his faction quickly criticize him for helping Wilfried enter the Ivory Tower 2 years prior. But Arnsbach's involvement in Rozemyne's attack at the castle means tensions between their two duchies aren't going to cool anytime soon. Lorenz now understands why his brother's marriage proposal was rejected, but Roderick doesn't really care. He's the son of a second wife, not the heir to his house, and since he's not going to serve Wilfried, likely won't have good prospects for marriage. And that's on top of the physical abuse he's dealing with at home from his father being punished in the Ivory Tower incident. Some kids try to roast Roderick for causing this mess, but Matthias and Lorenz back him up. They're all banking on Wilfried staging a comeback with Georgine's support. Delusional, I know, but sure. In fact, Matthias' older brother already predicts that Wilfried is going to get engaged to Rozemyne, since Sylvester can't throw away the former Veronica faction. Sounds reasonable. And once Rozemyne can enter the library, Roderick starts staying there as often as he can to avoid the dorm. It's there he's able to chat with Felina, where his grudge festers somewhat about her serving Rozemyne while he can. Once he's got a spot, he gets transcribing, but that doesn't last too long, as all of his feelings from the past 2 years finally start to boil over. The abuse he's felt and the jealousy over Felina makes him not want to transcribe, but give Rozemyne a story only he could, and thus he vows to write one for the girl who saved him through his torment. There's a lot of crossover between this story and the one in the Royal Academy stories that makes it so you could read either one and get about the same amount of information. Roderick's abuse and treatment isn't really a secret in this series, but the inner workings of the former Veronica faction as they rationalize their standing in Ehrenfest is something this story adds. Seeing how they try and plan Wilfried's comeback based on the little information they have, and also hints about how cunning Grausam is since he foresaw Rozemyne and Wilfried's engagement. That explains why in part 4 volume 4, he's completely unfazed when it's announced. This does have a good bit of foreshadowing, but the rest of it does feel like a bit of a rehash, despite coming first. Next is Coming Home from the Royal Academy from Felina's perspective. This is another sales bonus from part 4 volume 3 that was cut down, so there will be some overlap with the next one up. At the castle, Riarda introduces the apprentices to the adults back home, due to Rozemyne being thrown up in the air by Bonifacius, so she's out of it. The only new face here is Otillie, but Daniel tells Felina that if she has any questions to ask him. Otillie adds to let her know if Hartmut is going too far, of course, because that's Otillie's main concern throughout most of this series, keeping her son under control. And with that, they have their carriages packed up for their return trip home, leaving in a descending order of status. So Felina and her attendant Isberga chat on their short ride back to the estate. Isberga tells Felina to be proud having been selected to serve as a retainer, but she's not a full-time attendant. She's contracted to work during the school year only, so once they're home, this is gonna come to an end. She's from Felina's mother's side of the family and is doing this as a favor, but after this year, she's already promised to help out next year too. We learn in detail here that Felina's family is dirt poor, despite being nobles, and her father is putting them in a pretty bad spot, mostly because he married another woman who's somehow even worse off than they were. Jonsara was taken in to help raise Felina and Conrad, And the thing is, she did fine, until she got pregnant, and started abusing them both. Isberga warned her father not to get her pregnant in the first place until Conrad was in the academy, thus causing tensions to rise, since the house is Felina's mother's, meaning Felina will be the one to inherit it once she comes of age. So she wants her father to send Jonsara to a side building, but that's not happening. If they had that sort of money to prepare a side building and support Felina's lifestyle, they would have hired a live-in maid rather than have her father remarry. But Felina's new status as an archducal retainer should end her abuse. At least that's the hope. And once they're home, Ainera, Jonsara's attendant, and a single male servant greet them. Pretty disrespectful for Jonsara to not greet them herself, but I guess she's busy with the baby. Isberga wishes to see Conrad before leaving, however, they fight back against that since he's not baptized. Too bad Isberga is related enough to actually see Conrad, and thus he gets dragged out looking thinner than before they left. In fact, he's pretty excited to eat with his sister again. Unfortunately, Felina has work during the day, so she won't be able to. He starts to freak out a bit, but Ainera tells him that he promised to behave, so he quiets down. Isberga says her goodbyes. From there, Felina needs help getting out of her academy clothes and requests help getting dressed for work tomorrow. But Ainera is pretty annoyed by that request. She tells Felina to serve herself dinner and then leaves to go help with the baby once more. Great, so Felina puts on commoner clothes, ones that a person can actually put on themselves because they don't have all those back buttons, and eats her meal alone, feeling pretty lonely in the process. That's sad, and it's literally just some leftover soup, since they can't afford to hire a full-time chef for their estate. And after that, she realizes she still has to unpack her room before she can even go to sleep for the night. Here's our first glimpse into how bad Felina's living situation is. What we got in the mainline story shows a bad, but not nearly this bleak of a picture. Her family is apparently so poor, they can't even afford the staff to run their estate, and she has to wear commoner clothes in her day-to-day life. That lack of money is actually causing the issues back home, because her father had to remarry and is starting a new family. That's distancing Felina's mother's family, which is pretty damn crazy, because it's her estate and not her father's. So really, things are gonna crumble as soon as Felina comes of age anyway. This little glimpse shows us more why Felina is such an endearing character, because despite how bad her home life is and the fact that Rozemyne had to save her from it, we still didn't even get a full look at how badly she's abused until this book. Next is my knight in shining armor, still from Felina's perspective, and this is the actual sales bonus. I will skip some of the early details because they just rehash how shameful Felina's life is as a noble. Now, it doesn't really surprise her that some commoners probably live better lives than she does, and many rich merchants do, as we know. After reheating her breakfast, she goes to see Conrad and finds him still in bed. But he's not just sleeping, he's bubbling from having too much mana. She scolds him for not using his tool, but realizes it's missing. Oh no. That's when Conrad lets the abuse he's been dealing with slip. Jonsara beats him and took his tool for her baby. Felina flies off in a rage to go get it back and snatches it from Jonsara, but Conrad's mana has already been drained. Seriously? Yeah. And while Felina is pissed, Conrad followed him behind her to see what his sister is doing, only for Jonsara to use that moment to bind Felina in bands of light and take the tool back from her again. Conrad freaks out at the mere sight of a stop, and that's when Felina tells them that they'd better let her go, as she uses one of the tools that Hartmut taught her well, bluffing. That way she can get released. She tells them that Riarda and Otilli will notice if she doesn't report to the castle, but Jonsara assumes that she's just lying. Since she didn't use titles, those must just be some friends of hers from the playroom. Yeah, a random lay noble housewife wouldn't know two archnobles by name, even if they are pretty high ranking in status. Thus, she decides to play it safe and send Ordnance off to the castle to inform them that Felina is sick. Or Felina yells for help in the background, as we know. That pisses off Jonsara, and she throws Felina and Conrad into a closet as punishment. Yeah, things aren't looking great, and Conrad's increased emotional state is putting him in danger, so she tells him some night stories to ease his mind a bit, and that actually seems to work, as his man is calming down. Her only hope is that a real knight in shining armor will come save them both, and soon enough, she hears voices walking by. That's when she kicks the door and Daniel and Lisaletta open it for a rescue. Yeah, Daniel wraps Felina up in his cape to hide her commoner clothes too, because the dude's a real gentleman, and this is basically the start of her romantic feelings for Daniel. As he carries her out, Felina notices that her father isn't relieved to see her at all, but he's only looking past her to see if Jonsara is safe. And that basically says it all right there. Dude just straight up doesn't care about her anymore. With that, Felina and Conrad were rescued, and things played out as they did in the books. But at the castle later on, Felina endures some harsh comments about being a mere lay noble in Rozemyne's service. But standing there to protect her from those is Daniel, someone who's used to it himself, and explains she'll stop getting those criticisms once she gets more mana through Rozemyne's compression method. Yeah, he's pretty dense when it comes to love, but she's got it pretty bad for him. While this story doesn't add much in terms of new information, it does show Felina's perspective for a pretty pivotal scene for her, and in that aspect, it's a pretty damn good side story. We see her struggles, the abuse she's dealing with, and why it was so important for her to get out. That this wasn't just a one-off thing, but the culmination of a year or so of abuse that finally broke. Her family denying her career and not even caring if she's okay speaks volumes about how Felina leaving her house was the right choice for her. This one gives you a more clear perspective on that. Next up is a new step forward from Charlotte's perspective, taking place during Part 4, Volume 4, when she's suddenly called to a tea party by her mom. The announcement of Wilfried and Rozemyne's engagement has upended noble society by removing both Rozemyne from the race and solidifying Wilfried for the spot of Archduke in an effort to unify the Lies Gang and Veronica factions once and for all. And amidst all this, Rozemyne returned to the temple where Wilfried is handling meeting after meeting. So where does this leave Charlotte? That's why Florencia called her. They talk of the academy first. Rozemyne only told Charlotte about the library, Wilfried complained about problems she caused, and Charlotte's retainers who were attending gave a much more appropriate appraisal of the events. Rozemyne's influence is huge, and that's been left out of most of the reports because of bias. So now that Florencia has a better picture of what happened, she apologizes to Charlotte for the turn that things have taken. This engagement has removed her for the race for Ob. She was raised to beat her brother, but with him guaranteed the position essentially at birth, Charlotte lost her purpose before even starting. Then the Ivory Tower incident gave her another shot, but now that's been taken away from her too, because of this engagement. Basically, all of her training her entire life has been for nothing, and she finally breaks down and cries. It's not fair that everything keeps going Wilfried's way, when the kid's a bumbling idiot. If Rozemyne was going to be Ob, she could at least understand, but Wilfried? After calming down, she realizes it's best for the duchy. However, when Florencia wants her to start supporting Wilfried and Rozemyne after she marries into another duchy and such, Charlotte's at a loss. It's now painfully clear they both have very different views of their relationship. Florencia thinks that Charlotte and Wilfried is pretty close, but Charlotte views him much more as a rival, and Melchior as her only true brother. Probably because he was raised by Veronica and not alongside Charlotte. Not that she'll admit that here because it would break Florencia's heart. Though she feels that Rozemyne would still be a better Archduchess, Charlotte will support Wilfried for her sake. However, Wilfried should step up and do so too. Turns out Ferdinand thought something similar. Rather than Rozemyne supporting Wilfried as Ob, he thought Wilfried should learn to control her impulses. Okay, so with Rozemyne's marriage decided, Charlotte will be the top-ranking duchy's next target. And for that, Charlotte will need a strong bond with her family here to secure good treatment after marriage. Florencia knows that firsthand, so she obviously decides to deepen that bond with Rozemyne over Wilfried. That's a surprise, to the point that Charlotte even says if she had been born a man, she would have married Rozemyne herself. So with this conversation giving Charlotte a new perspective, she moves towards her new goal of being a good future first wife in a new duchy. This one gives us a much needed glimpse behind the scenes for Charlotte. We get a lot about her mental state at the time, as we're told that the political situation in Ehrenfest is really tense at this point. But really, Charlotte's been putting on a brave face. She lost her goal and was told to start supporting two people who took it from her. And the fact that she still idolizes Rozemyne despite her promise to support Charlotte shows their bond is much deeper than hers and Wilfried's. I also think it's important how this clarifies her thoughts on Wilfried as her brother, and a person too. People like to say that they're super close, but we see Charlotte doesn't feel that way, and that kind of informs a lot of her decision making in the future. Next, we're sticking with Charlotte for the non-cut portion of Part 4 Volume 4 sale bonus, with one simply titled My Task. This contains a lot of the same dialogue since it needed reworked for the actual release. But as she studies documents for printing, as she'll be tackling that work come spring before even entering the academy, Marvin, a scholar assigned to Charlotte for this, explains that Rozemyne's involvement clearly shows she's prioritizing Ehrenfest over her own interests, by not monopolizing it to build a faction. True enough, though her marriage will probably do that for her, right? Or not, since apparently neither faction approves of this engagement. So really, both her and Wilfried are on shaky ground now. However, Rozemyne is definitely in a more precarious position. If she's not showing results, most nobles would call for her to be reduced in status as an adopted daughter. That would also just fix the faction struggles. So this is pretty crazy she's just sharing this wealth and all. Yeah, Charlotte now feels more than ever that Rozemyne only does good things for her. That's when an ordinance arrives telling Charlotte to look into the city blueprints for the sewer system, as the lower city should have been done too. Is that even important? Yeah, it is with the incoming merchants. So they race off to the book room where they meet up with Hartmut and Elvira's group to find the relevant documents. They don't get all that they need, but they do get enough to compile a report for Sylvester. Nice. And Charlotte will speak to him about it at dinner to move progress along on remodeling the lower city. After dinner that night though, Charlotte gets a visit from Oswald while she was in the bath, so her retainers took a pretty infuriating message, basically saying Charlotte shouldn't be involved with this because she's gonna be leaving the duchy as soon as she comes of age, so she should probably be letting Wilfried handle it, right? What a jackass. Charlotte can't just hand this work over since Rozemyne asked her and not Wilfried, and thus decides to involve Wilfried to help him build some more accomplishments. And share the work. Why not? And since they're digging a bit deeper for Sylvester the next day, she can include her brother to share credit. After all, Florencia did tell her to get closer to her siblings. The next day, Wilfried makes an annoying comment, saying she's the one who summoned Oswald to ask for help, rather than initially extending it because Wilfried complained about it. Her jaw about drops, but that's when she and her retainers notice Oswald smirk. Yeah, they fell right into his stupid Veronica-inspired trap. Wilfried then remarks that Rozemyne needs to get her retainers into shape too, based on how they acted in the academy, but Charlotte expands on that to indirectly tell Wilfried to do the same. He doesn't get the hint, obviously. So yeah, Charlotte remarks how she wouldn't have lost to Wilfried had she been born a man, and that makes all their retainers tense. But that too goes over Wilfried's head, and thus they continue their work on the remodel. It's pretty interesting that the earlier segment was considered cut from this one, because both stories could have been stitched together pretty seamlessly for a complete narrative, assuming page count hadn't been an issue, which it probably was. The message in this story is more about Wilfried and Ehrenfest's views on the situation, while also foreshadowing Oswald's behavior, as he's gone from someone who's capable when told to shape up in part 3, to an absolute asshole working behind the scenes to prop his lord up. It seems jarring until you notice the pattern that as soon as Wilfried's position is secured, he slips right back into his old ways of thinking, and that makes him much more loathsome than you'd otherwise think. And lastly, we have an unpublished side story from Part 4, Volume 4 from Felina's perspective, called I Serve Lady Rozemyne. This isn't a redemption for her family, but shows the evolution of how things used to be. At her baptism, she's in the waiting room with her great aunt since lay nobles struggle to find attendants capable of visiting the castle, so family members usually fill in that role. She's wearing her mother's hand-me-down dress, which makes her pretty happy. That's when her eyes lock with Rozemyne, who's looking stunning, and waves. But Felina isn't really sure what to do since she was told not to do anything at all. In retrospect, she probably should have waved back, especially now that she knows how Rozemyne is. At the baptism itself, she performs her role perfectly, and then her debut goes off without a hitch. Joan Sara and her father congratulate her, saying she did well, but after listening to the other kids, she realizes the gap in education. Then Rozemyne's turn comes up where she fires off that massive blessing on accident. The nobles are all impressed as Ferdinand races her out of the hall, but Felina's father remarks that while she's known as a saint, she won't treat lay nobles any better than arch nobles, and thus warns Felina to be careful since they'll be classmates at the Royal Academy. The playroom turns out to be nothing like she was told. Rozemyne did overhaul it that year. One day, Rozemyne approaches Felina to request stories from her, and she writes them down for her. And after they finish, she gives Felina the copies that she wrote and tells her to transcribe them to learn her letters. She eagerly practices her writing in anticipation for the next winter, but when it comes, she learned what happened to Rozemyne. Charlotte is speaking to Daniel in the playroom, and that gives her some hope. And that's when she tells Daniel her wish to join Rozemyne's service too, since Daniel is a lay noble like her. But rather than shooting her down like most other nobles would, he asks her what she can do for his lady, and Felina offers the story she transcribed as well as the desire to gather even more. That would be exactly what Rozemyne wants. So Daniel remarks how Rozemyne doesn't pick people based on status, so as long as she works hard, she'll probably be recognized for it. Fast forward to her working with Rozemyne in the temple under Ferdinand, and those experiences are what brought her to this moment. She's now more resolute than ever to serve her lady. The only issue is Ferdinand keeps rejecting her math skills. In fact, He's straight up scary. The Rozemyne comforts her, saying she'll get used to reading beyond his emotionless expression soon enough. And after Rozemyne goes to hand hers in, Felina's sure she saw his expression somewhat soften. Later in the High Bishop chambers, Hartmut leaves while Felina continues to transcribe the Dunkelfelger book. Why? Well, he's off to the orphanage to go gather the origins of her saint legend, of course, and he expects to finish right as Rozemyne finishes reading. And sure enough, he does, impressing Felina with his competence. You know, I really appreciate the details we see from Felina about noble society from her perspective in the first half, though the second is much less focused. Yeah, this is all about Felina's growth, but we've already seen that firsthand. Though there are a few key details this does foreshadow that makes me regret that it didn't get published until now. One is the subtle hints about hers and Daniel's relationship, even as far back as her second winter in the playroom, and he's always been a source of inspiration for Felina. But also how Hartmut is gathering information in the temple. Yeah, that's been talked about before, but here we actually see him slipping away to go do it. And just how he went about this whole process makes for an interesting detail in hindsight. Those are important aspects of this story that will pay off and be built on later on. So it's nice to see them reference this early on. So that's it. That's the first short stories collection down. And there's a clear theme in what I enjoyed in this book and why I think readers should check it out. These side stories, and doubly so for the ones in the main books, are what flesh this world out. It shows how the characters interact outside of Rozemyne's influence, creating a web of tangled plot lines that come up in varying ways down the line. And sometimes it's just nice seeing a different perspective on events. The next short stories collection is going to be out in early 2025, and I'll probably do a video once I've wrapped up the entire series. But that about brings this video to a close. So I guess all that's really left to say is, for now, you've made it to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and do all the other YouTube stuff to help the channel grow. You can also join my Discord with a link down in the description. And if you really want to support me, you can head on over to my Patreon and pick up some extra perks. And speaking of Patreon, I'd like to give a special thanks to Autumn Stott, JMonth33A, Pokeflute, Robin DBL, Samuel Chen, Sazi, Tristan, and Von Sturm for their continued support. Thanks for watching.